Plane 9 from Nantucket is the 16th episode of the second season of Wings, and it's not a bad episode. We have some nice moments with Joe and Brian, we have some interesting moments with Helen and Faye, but it's definitely not one of my favourite episodes, and that's largely because the subject matter just doesn't really appeal to me. So there will be spoilers as I talk about very briefly what happens in this, but to be honest, out of every episode that I've reviewed, I've watched the show in its entirety before, but certainly of the ones that I've discussed up until this point, I'd say it's the one where I have the least thoughts. That's not to say I didn't like it. I just personally didn't find it to be that interesting compared to other episodes. So I'll deal with the story with Faye and Helen the most. It definitely is padding, and this involves the fact that Faye owed Helen money, and she said she gave her the money. And Helen is certain that she didn't. And they end up having an arm wrestle, which was pretty well done. And it turns out that the money had just slipped off of the counter. Lowell found it. That's basically the end of that. It is definitely padding, and it's absolutely fine. It works well enough. The main story involves Joe and Brian going out in the plane together. They're transporting some mannequins, which I have to say, I didn't remember that part of the episode from when I saw it last. And to begin with, we don't see the rest of the plane. We just focus on Joe and Brian, and they're talking, and then as the camera pans out and we just see all of these mannequins, I'd be willing to bet that not one person watching this episode expected them to be mannequins. So credit where it's due, there were some good surprise elements to this episode, and then they both happen to see what they think is a UFO. And what I think is interesting about this, as I said, there are some interesting things, but as a whole, I wasn't that bothered about it. But when Brian said they'd seen a UFO, and Joe agreed. This is when they're up in the plane. I just didn't expect Joe to be the type of person to immediately think, oh yes, that must be a UFO. I think he might have been a bit more logical about it. But when they were back down on the ground, actually his opinion changed and he decided to not admit to seeing the UFO. I think he still believed it, but he wasn't willing to actually tell anybody about it, because if word gets out and it's investigated, and if it's proven to be something other than a UFO, it could potentially blacklist them, and obviously Joe doesn't want that. But I can imagine it would have been very frustrating to be Brian in that moment, where Joe up in the air was all willing to say it was a UFO, but when they're down on the ground, he's not willing at all, and that must have been very, very frustrating. The way the episode played out was absolutely fine. I don't have any complaints about it, but also I didn't necessarily, as I said, think it was the most fascinating. We meet some relatively interesting characters with the people who are investigating the UFOs, and the reveal with them with the foil hats on and things I thought was pretty decent, pretty well done. The element of surprise there I thought worked really well, but ultimately, as I said, it wasn't, for me, the most interesting. That being said, Roy saying Nanu Nanu as a nod to Mork, absolutely loved that moment. So some good bits, some interesting character behaviours, but needless to say, in general, Plane 9 from Nantucket is definitely not a personal favourite.